Hi, and welcome to Current Conversations, where we dive into inspiring stories and insights from those who are creating meaningful change in conservation and beyond. I'm Bailey Smith, and this is Katie Warning. We're both from the Rivers Are Life team. And on this episode, we'd like to introduce you to Boyce Upholt, an award-winning journalist whose writing has appeared in many publications, including The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the Oxford American. And now he's published this book, The Great River, which chronicles the history of the Mississippi River and the history of human meddling that has transformed both it and America. So, Boyce, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Well, to start off, could you just tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write a full-length book about the Mississippi?
Yeah. It's I think when I first imagined or dreamed of becoming a writer back when I was in sixth grade, I think I would have been surprised that this was my first book, because I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, which is nowhere near the Mississippi River, not in the Mississippi watershed. But basically, as a 25-year-old, I wound up working for a nonprofit in Mississippi, not far from the river. And that's kind of where I got my start writing, working in journalism. And even then, I wasn't thinking that much about the river until 6 years into that stay there. Wound up writing a profile of a canoe guide named John Ruskey. And if people don't know John's work, they should definitely check him out. He's sort of a legend on the Mississippi. So to write about John, I had to go out and see the river with John. And so spent 2 nights and 3 days canoeing and camping with him, kind of in Louisiana and Mississippi, kind of on the Mississippi and on the Atchafalaya River as well. And up to that point, I kind of thought the Mississippi, in my head, my picture of it was this big engineered toxic ditch. And being out there with John made me fall in love with the river and wanted to go back as much as possible. And that was the starting point. I just got obsessed and spent more and more time there until I realized I'm happy enough on this river to spend the long years that it would take to write a full-length book. And here we are.
I can't even imagine canoeing the Mississippi. So I've been on the Mississippi in a boat. I've been up all the way at the top, up in Minnesota, and then down in like the St. Louis region.
Yep.
And it's huge. So when I think about canoeing a river, I think about Michigan rivers, which aren't big like the Mississippi. I just think like camping and canoeing, that really would pull you in and just keep you like hooked as to like what a great place to live, and so far away from Connecticut, like
yes.
leaps and bounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the camping and the river's big in St. Louis, and then it's even bigger. I mean, if you get down, there are places where it's basically a mile wide at the confluence with the Ohio. It's just astounding. Honestly, sometimes in a canoe, it can be too big. I find that I love days out there canoeing, just like the work of it. But I find I don't even realize how beautiful the Mississippi is until you stop and you do the camping part, and then you see these giant sandbar. It's just, someone once compared it to being in the Alaskan bush. It's just like the scale of the landscape is so big out there, especially down here in the South. And so, yeah, having those experiences, kind of watching the sunset from a sandbar, was unbeatable and changed my life.
Incredible. So in the book, you really dive into the history of the river. With some of this information dating like way back 600 million years ago. Where did you start? Who did you interview? What resources did you use? Your book covers like the life of the river. How did you even like begin?
Yes, it's hard to, it depends on it depends on what you consider the beginning of the book, right? I think I decided that I was going to write a book about the Mississippi River long before anyone with the power to make that happen decided or even cared or knew who I was, right? So I was living in this small town in Mississippi, Cleveland, Indianola, a couple different towns. But even there, I was starting this project and writing little essays about the river there in my backyard. And I would go out on canoe trips with friends and turn those into like little pieces for local magazines. So the project has kind of kept growing and growing through the years. Which helped because I sort of got to learn things just as what I needed for this little bit of history that I'm writing right now and this next little bit. And then I was like, maybe I'll write a book about the river here in the Mississippi Delta. And then when I got around to writing a book about the entire river, I had some semblance of the history and I could go back and dive back in. I mean, part of it was in 2017 before I sold the book, but I was pretty committed. Something was going to happen at this point. I wound up canoeing from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico with John Ruskey. And I just packed a lot of books in my dry bag too. And I said, what better place to sort of wrap my head around the totality of this history than to kind of get out of the canoe every evening and sit there and try and understand kind of all the ways that this river has been.
It sounds like your research of the Mississippi started with being on the Mississippi and talking to people from the Mississippi and that have had the river influence their lives. But I'm curious, like, how far back do like word of mouth kind of accounts date back to? So I'm sure, you know, when you look at 6 million years ago, how were the landforms moving to eventually create the Mississippi? That's all done in research books and online now. But how far back does word of mouth go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I've ever thought about it in those terms. I mean, I hear from a lot of people now, you know, about their memories. And so occasionally, I don't know. Again, I think I've heard from a person or two. No, I was going to say like the 1927 flood, but they would be very old now and very young, right? But I've definitely heard from people talking stories about their parents, what their parents said about these floods of the past. So you get that intergenerational change. But I think in a certain sense, like even once you start thinking about tales being told and the way they've been passed down through the generations, I think it's important to think about oral history and indigenous cultures. Because right down here where I am in Louisiana, this region, Bulbancha, it was called by a lot of the indigenous people here at the land of many tongues. One of the creation myths down here is that this landscape was built by a crawfish kind of diving down and picking, like the world was all water. And then this crawfish dove down, got a little bit of mud and brought that up and made the world. And that's in some ways not that far from the science, right? It's like the land here was built because the river carried mud down. So it's like different source, but it is this mud coming up and filling in a watery space. And so I count that as stories being passed down. And so it does go back, you know, that would be essentially 12,000 years if we're saying that story has been passed down since this land was created.
That's crazy. It really goes to show, like, even if the stories aren't scientifically correct necessarily, it goes to show how much the rivers really affect our society and our culture and how we tell stories and what gets passed on generationally, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, not scientifically correct, but in some ways closer to this, like, was closer to the true science than what a lot of sort of white and European settlers believed for a long time. So.
Yeah.
So we learned about your book from Clint at LSU. Did you utilize any of their services as you were doing your research for this?
It was not in the book, but I first met Clint, again, in this sort of like the long research period before I sold the book, but when I knew I was going to write it at one point. There's a great group called the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, and they basically take environmental journalists on field trips. And so I get to go on this week-long trip down the lower Mississippi River with them, which was cool because, you know, I had already canoed a lot of that whole stretch, but we were kind of going by land, looking at it differently. And so that was the first time I got to visit the River Center at LSU and see the giant model that they have of the Mississippi River Delta. And in that was not in the final draft, but there were some early drafts of the book that included sort of my visit there and looking out on that map, because it's just super cool. It's all white at first, and they could turn on this projector and put the landscape on top of it. It's just a very cool way to think about this landscape in the place where I live. So then I kind of reconnected with Clint after the book came out, and he's been a great partner. We did an event together up at LSU, a reading between his department and the English department. So it's been great to, tap into this rich river community here in Louisiana.
Well, and you hit it like the nail on the head. Tapping into the community in the river world is a tremendous experience, and the Mississippi is gigantic. So having Clint as kind of a resource to that watershed is one thing, but how far up the Mississippi have you gone all the way to the top?
I have gone all the way. Yeah, I was reluctant to do so at first. I think it's a bias of being a man of the lower Mississippi River, but to me, what makes the Mississippi River so exceptional, right, is just how much water is in this, how big this watershed is. And so the Mississippi, kind of by definition to me, the great river, as I call it in the book, that can't have one headwaters. And so it's sort of frustrating to me the way we are so committed to finding one singular headwaters. But while I was researching the book, I knew I had to go to see, that northern part of the Mississippi. There's some reporting on Minnesota about some issues about dams there I wanted to do. So I was like, I'm going to drive up and see Lake Itasca. And it was actually really moving to be there, sort of despite that objection I saw, right? Like it's in the middle of nowhere. It's so far from anything. And there were all these families that were there basically making their river pilgrimages. And it was like, okay, fine. If this is how we convince people to go care about rivers, great. But my thought while I was there is like, I wish we cared about, I think there are infinite headwaters on the Mississippi River. And I wish we cared about all of those headwaters the way we care about Lake Itasca. But yes, I went all the way up. I've driven up the Missouri all the way to Kansas City. So I was trying to think on this watershed scale and wrap my head around as much as I could.
So it sounds like kind of the lower Mississippi really has your heart. But are there any like nooks and crannies that are kind of little known secrets that you've glommed onto that are like really the coolest spots on the Mississippi?
Oh, I mean, I don't think it's a secret at all. I think the other, and it's not a nook or a cranny, it's a very large area, but the other region that holds my heart, not as sort of like I consider myself at this point deeply local on the lower Mississippi River. It is my river, right? It's my mud down here. Not that I own it, but it's like the mud that's made me in a way. The Driftless up on the upper Mississippi River is not my river, right? But it's a place I love to visit. I like hadn't visited it until I was working on this book. I've gotten to go back a few times now. And it's just so gorgeous. It's so different than down here in the South. The floodplain is so large, so the river basically runs through a flat landscape. So to be able to see these hills rising up alongside the upper Mississippi River it's just so gorgeous. So hoping to get back again soon. But more nook and cranny-ish, I'm going to take us back to the lower Mississippi River. My favorite stretch down here, it's called the Old White River Channel. There's this point in Mississippi and Arkansas where basically the Arkansas, Mississippi, and White Rivers all meet very close. And the old end of the White River, it used to be the end of the White River. The rivers have shifted now, and so now it's just kind of a back channel on Mississippi River. That means it's a pretty substantial sized channel, but it's not substantial enough for the towboats to go through. So you can go down there in a canoe and like just might have to still watch for some people and like fishing boats going really fast, but you can worry a lot less about the traffic of the Mississippi River and kind of get this sense of what the Mississippi River once looked like. It's a really great, it's hard to get there, but once you're there, it's a really good sort of 2-day, 1-night paddle trip. So if anyone wants to visit the lower Mississippi River, that's a good place to do it.
That's kind of my rule of thumb. The hardest places to get to are always the best places to go, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The nature where you can still experience nature, where it's quiet and you can hear the birds cutting through, the sky as they fly. That's the best canoeing.
Exactly. And that's one thing I want to underline is that is, even when the towboats are there, that is the case on the lower Mississippi River. Is one of the things that really astounded me. It's like I knew that the Mississippi had been so engineered and it has been so engineered. And yet you get out there and you kind of forget that engineering because it's, these levees are so big and they split it off from sort of the land that we live in that you really feel like you're going into an entirely separate territory when you cross over the levees down there.
Incredible. That kind of answered my next question, but maybe you have something else. So as you did all this research, really from like living there and experiencing it, is there like one thing that surprised you the most about the Mississippi that you just weren't expecting?
Yeah, I mean, that I did that I gave you my first answer was the first surprise was like, oh, it's beautiful and wild and not just engineered and toxic. But I think, right, that was what started this whole process, was learning that the first night I canoed and camped out there. And I think this book in many ways has been like surprise after surprise, revelation after revelation. I think the one that comes to mind on like the scale of the book, the biggest change while working on the book was some of what I was talking about before with the Indigenous history. I can't believe I thought this when I sold the book, but I was like, of course I'll have to mention Indigenous history in this book, but it'll be a couple pages and then I'll move on, because it felt, I want to tell the tale of sort of how the river came to be what it is now. And there's 200 years of engineering I had to get through. But as I started to learn about the wisdom that was and still is passed down amongst Indigenous people, learn about sort of this whole, call it a secret history almost, because at least it wasn't taught to me in my high school in suburban Connecticut, this complex, epic, layered tale of all these different cultures that lived along the Mississippi River for thousands and thousands of years. It was so revelatory to me, and learning what I could about how those cultures sort of engaged with the river, what they thought of the river to the extent we can tell thousands of years later, transformed the way I saw the river and transformed the way I think about what I want for the river's future. And so that, I don't know, there's a lot in that, but that was the surprise to me. It was like, oh, there's this vision of the Mississippi River as like a living being almost, that existed before white settlers came. It continues to exist, but is often sort of muted and forgotten. But I think that's what we need to bring back and pay attention to.
Yeah, I did not know about the mounds. And so as I was reading the book and you were explaining, the mounds along the river, it made me stop and wonder how many times I've seen something along a river that I just thought was, oh, that's just nature. But maybe it is, it was something from the indigenous communities all those years ago that I've gone past a million times and had no idea what the semblance was.
Yeah, and maybe I should say, I bet some listeners don't know what the mounds are. So mounds, earthworks, they're also called, there are lots of kinds, lots of shapes, lots of sizes, but these sort of like soil-based landforms that have been built along the Mississippi River and many tributaries. And if you're on the river, you don't often see the earthworks. They're a little further off, but they're built in the floodplain. In the Mississippi Delta where I live, there's lots of fairly small earthworks, and I knew what they were, but they didn't. I was like, it's just kind of a lump of soil. But it's the history of those earthworks in particular that really moved me, because I began to see them as sort of symbols about the interconnection of wetlands and drier lands. They like sort of sit on the edges of things. They were also symbols of people working together collaboratively to build, monuments, just ways of acknowledging their care for one another, their care for the world. And so, yeah, I used to drive around the rural Mississippi and see these indigenous earthworks and be like, oh, another mound of soil. And now I see them. I'm like, oh, yes, this is a monument to the way we should be living on this planet.
So, Boyce, before we sign off, is there anything you have coming up, anything you want to share with the Current Conversations audience that we haven't asked yet?
Yeah, I would love to shout out the next big project I'm working on, which is a magazine called Southlands. It's going to be twice a year to start, and the first issue I'm hoping will be out this fall. And the idea here is to capture the beauty of nature and the different relationships we have with nature down here in the South. I think there's a lot of publications like this out west, but sometimes people forget how much we have down here in the South. So if people are interested in that, right now there's a Substack, southlands.substack.com, that I've been doing. And then again, in the coming months, will be ramped up into a print version.
Awesome. And do you have a website or any social handles that we should drive people to?
Yeah, you can find me at boyceupholt.com as the sort of the main hub, and you can jump off from there to Blue Sky and to Instagram are the two I use the most. So.
Well, thank you so much, Boyce, for sharing your time with us today, for sharing so much knowledge and history in this book for people to enjoy. We really appreciate you and the work that you've done on the Mississippi.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. I really appreciate y'all's support.
Cool. Well, for anybody who's interested in reading The Great River, copies that have been autographed by Boyce are available in our online store. So you can go to shop.riversourlife.com, and 10% of all of those proceeds from book sales will pay it forward to support continued Rivers Are Life impact projects and other river heroes who are doing great work on rivers around our world.